Before we begin, Galactic Horrors is now on Patreon. Get daily stories in one place, with no ads and no interruptions. Link is in the description or search Galactic Horrors on Patreon. Now, let's begin the transmission. The call came at third watch, which meant it was bad. Nobody pulled me out of a sleep cycle for ration disputes or corridor brawls. My comm chimed twice before I killed the alarm and sat up in the dark of my quarters, already reading the display through the blur of interrupted rest. Maintenance priority, primary recycler, Bay 4, human remains found. Human remains. On the Colburn, that phrase covered everything from a severed finger caught in a thresher drum to a full corpse, and maintenance crews used it for both because they had learned to avoid assumptions over open channels. I dressed in under a minute, boots laced tight for the ladderways, and left D-deck housing at a walk that wanted to be a run. I am Neil Haddon, Chief Investigator for the Deck Security Bureau. I have held the post for 11 years aboard a ship that has been falling through open space for 212 of its projected 500. Nobody alive will see the destination. My father knew that. His mother knew it before him. We are the middle generations, born to keep the Colburn running so someone else's grandchildren can walk on solid ground. My contribution to that effort is making sure 4,000 souls do not rob, assault, defraud or kill each other in the centuries between launch and landfall. Most of my caseload is petty. Doctored ration cards, stolen fabrication credits, domestic violence in the close quarters of family births. Murder is a demographic event. The last one was 9 years before I took the post, a stabbing in the machine shop over a gambling debt. Open and shut in 4 hours. This would be different. I could feel it before I reached the recycler bay, in the way the maintenance foreman, a heavy-set man named Judd, met me at the pressure door with his crew standing well back from the catwalk railing. "Still cycling," Judd said. "We haven't shut it down." "Show me why." He led me onto the catwalk. Primary Recycler 4 sat below us in the center of the bay, a transparent cylinder 3 meters across and 5 tall, mounted on a steel plinth that connected it to the ship's main water distribution headers. The cylinder was full. Clean water circulated through it in a slow, visible current, driven by the forward flow pumps that fed half the residential decks above us. Inside the current, suspended upright by the gentle push of the circulation, a man floated with his arms loose at his sides and his robes drifting around his legs in soft, heavy folds. I recognized the robes before I recognized the face. Chaplaincy vestments, the pale blue-grey fabric worn by the clergy of the hydroponics division, the men and women who blessed the ship's water and crops under an old tradition that went back to the first generation. The dead man's head was tilted slightly upward. The current moved through his open mouth, giving him the terrible appearance of drinking. His hair waved in the flow like something rooted to the seafloor of a world none of us had ever touched. "Malcolm Greaves," Judd said behind me, "the hydroponics chaplain. Been in there since at least 2200 by the circulation timer. We found him at 0410 during standard inspection. 6 hours in the water. 6 hours cycling through the ship's primary purification loop, the clean water passing around and through him, while 4,000 people drank from the taps above." "Why haven't you pulled him out?" Judd wiped his forehead with the back of his wrist. "We shut the outflow, but the recycler's still pressurized. If we crack the hatch with a body in the column, we risk backflow into the main header. Contamination would hit residential distribution inside 20 minutes. So drain it." "Drain cycle takes 45 minutes. I wanted your authorization first." "You have it. Start the drain." While Judd and his crew initiated the sequence, I studied the cylinder from the catwalk. The access hatch, a reinforced oval door at the base of the column, was sealed tight. I dropped down the ladder to deck level and checked the locking mechanism. Mag sealed and credential locked, standard for a primary recycler unit. I pulled the access log from the panel beside the hatch. The display showed a single entry from the previous night. "Malcolm Greaves, chaplaincy authorization, 21:42 hours. entry, and seal. The log carried his arrival, the hatch closure, and 72 hours of otherwise empty credential history. From every record the system kept, Greaves had walked in alone, sealed the hatch behind him, and drowned inside a functioning water purifier. The drain took its 45 minutes. I watched the water level drop centimetre by centimetre down the transparent wall, and I watched Greaves descend with it, his robes darkening as they left the current and took on their own dead weight. When the last of the water gurgled through the floor grating and the pumps cycled off, his body settled against the inner wall of the cylinder in a wet heap, legs folded, arms draped across his knees. His face had the grey-white look of extended immersion. His fingers curled inward toward his palms. I opened the hatch. Dr. Len Corwin, the ship's senior medical examiner, had arrived during the drain cycle and was already gloved and waiting. We entered the cylinder together. The interior curved around us, everything slick, water still dripping from the upper injection ports. Corwin knelt beside the body and began his preliminary examination, while I stood close enough to see what his hands uncovered. "Drowning," Corwin said after 3 minutes, "consistent with the environment. I see clean skin at the throat, skull and torso. No obvious assault trauma." "His hands." Corwin turned Greaves's right hand palm up. The fingertips were raw, abraded to the deep tissue in places, and 3 nails were missing entirely. The left hand showed similar damage but less severe, torn cuticles, cracked nails, surface lacerations. "Panic behavior," Corwin suggested, clawing at the interior walls. I looked at the walls, smooth composite, wet, with no visible score marks. Then I looked at Greaves's right hand again. The abrasion pattern was wrong for flat palm scraping. The damage concentrated on the fingertips and the inner curl of the fingers, consistent with gripping and turning something. A handle, a wheel, a resistant mechanism, with force that exceeded what the tissue could take. "Note that," I told Corwin. "Gripping pattern, right hand, not clawing." Corwin noted it. I left him with the body and climbed back to the catwalk to survey the full bay. Recycler 4 sat in a row of 6 primary units, each connected to the ship's water distribution network by a web of pipes, valves, and filtration housings. The adjacent units were running normally, but the secondary filtration rack between units 4 and 5 was partially disassembled. I walked along the catwalk until I was above it and looked down. 3 membrane housings stood open and empty. The filtration membranes, translucent sheets that strained particulates from the water before it entered residential distribution, had been removed. Clean cuts at the mounting brackets, professional work, done with the right tools. Judd came up beside me when I pointed it out. "Replacement parts are on back order," he said. "Fabrication queue's been jammed for months. We've been running compensatory flow through units 3 and 6 to cover the gap." "Who removed these membranes?" Judd hesitated. "That's chaplaincy-maintained equipment. They do their own inspections on anything connected to the blessing cycle." "When were they last inspected?" "I'd have to check. We don't track chaplaincy maintenance on our schedule. They file separately." I stood on the catwalk after Judd went back to his crew, looking down at the drained recycler where Corwin was still working over the body. Beside it, the empty membrane housing sat open on the rack. Above them, dark pipe mouths ran into the walls and ceilings, carrying water to 4,000 people who trusted the ship's systems to keep them alive. 3 missing membranes and a dead chaplain sealed inside his own recycler. I went to find out who Malcolm Greaves had been. The chaplaincy occupied a set of rooms at the aft end of the hydroponics block, wedged between the main grow bays and the atmospheric processing plant. An office, a small blessing chamber with a shallow basin and a water tap, and personal quarters for the ranking clergy. The air in the hydroponics block was warm and carried a green, loamy quality from the grow trays. Thousands of square meters of engineered crops under full-spectrum panels, producing food and oxygen for the ship's population. The chaplaincy had been part of this division since the first generation, when someone decided the people who kept the water and food alive deserved a spiritual custodian of their own. Brother Terence Gil met me at the chaplaincy door. Gil was young, mid-20s, thin, with close-cropped hair, and the pale complexion of someone who spent too many hours under artificial light. He wore the same blue-grey vestments as the dead man, though his were dry and pressed. His grief was visible but managed, and when I asked for access to Greaves's office and personal records, he agreed quickly while positioning himself where he could watch everything I touched. Greaves's workspace was orderly. Liturgical texts on a small shelf, the standard chaplaincy prayer books, their covers soft from use, work logs on the terminal, neatly filed, shift schedules, inspection reports, maintenance authorizations. I sat at Greaves's desk and began reading his recent entries while Gil hovered near the doorway. The discrepancies surfaced within the first hour. Greaves had filed inspection reports for filtration systems he had never physically visited. Access logs placed his credentials elsewhere during the reported inspections. 3 maintenance requests from general hydroponics staff had been cancelled under Greaves's authorization without explanation. His personal credentials had been used at locations and hours inconsistent with his schedule, including repeated third watch visits to the recycler bay over the past 6 weeks. Brother Gil, was Chaplain Greaves in the habit of working at night? He was dedicated, Gil said carefully. He often worked beyond his scheduled hours. Doing what? Private devotions? System inspections? The chaplaincy's responsibilities extend beyond regular shifts. I moved to the personal files. Behind the standard liturgical archives, I found a growing collection of doctrinal writing that used language I had never encountered in the chaplaincy's public materials. The term first water appeared repeatedly, a theological concept arguing that water passed through synthetic membranes and chemical treatment was spiritually dead, stripped of its capacity to sustain the human soul across the centuries of Voyage. The arguments were dense, internally consistent, and written over several years. The earliest entries were collaborative, with editing marks and marginal comments from a second contributor. The later entries were Greaves alone, and the tone changed. Less certainty, more qualification, passages revised and re-revised, arguing against his own prior convictions. One paragraph appeared in 5 versions. In the earliest, Greaves had written that discomfort during purification should be welcomed as proof of spiritual dependence leaving the body. In the last version, dated 9 days before his death, he had struck out the sentence so hard the stylus marks had scarred the tablet surface beneath the text. Below it, in smaller letters, he had written, "If the children sicken first, this is not doctrine. This is harm wearing doctrine's clothes." Gil saw me pause over the line. His eyes moved to it, then away. I pulled the chaplaincy organizational chart. Greaves had held the title of hydroponics chaplain, the ranking spiritual position in the division. Below him, Brother Gil served as assistant. Parallel to Greaves, holding authority over doctrinal matters and ceremonial practice, sat a name I had encountered only in passing during routine casework, Deacon Paul Fisk. Fisk had been with the chaplaincy for 15 years. His system access profile showed credential entries clustered around the ship's secondary and tertiary water systems, the smaller recyclers and distribution nodes on the lower decks, in a pattern that did not overlap with Greaves's primary system focus but covered a much wider range of the ship. "I need to see the lower maintenance bay," I told Gil. "Sub-level 2, compartment 14. Chaplaincy maintains access." Something moved behind Gil's eyes. A tightening around his mouth, suppressed almost immediately. "That compartment is used for devotional storage. It connects to active water system inventory. Under safety code, that makes it inspectable. I can open it for you." "Do that." The bay was on the lower hydroponics deck, accessible by a service ladder from the main block. Gil keyed the door with a chaplaincy override and stood aside. I went in first. The room should have contained spare filtration components, pipe fittings, valve assemblies, and replacement membranes. the maintenance stock for the hydroponics water systems. The supply racks along the walls were empty. In their place, the room had been rearranged around a central aisle that led from the door to a workbench at the far wall. From the ceiling, hung on wire hooks and suspension cable at varying heights, were the missing parts. Filtration membranes stretched flat and suspended horizontally, their translucent surfaces catching the overhead light, pale and veined with the residue of use. They hung like something skinned and spread for display. Valve assemblies dangled below them, heavy dark shapes turning slowly in the ventilation draft, dripping condensation onto the deck. Lengths of tubing coiled and looped in arrangements that suggested anatomy, a curved section like intestine, a branching connector like a vascular junction. The effect was organized, intentional, and deeply wrong. Functional components had been pulled from active life support systems and mounted as devotional objects. Below the hanging parts, on the cleared workbench, sat rows of ceramic bowls. Each held water, cloudy, brownish, with a visible sediment layer at the bottom. Unfiltered water, drawn from the system after the membranes had been removed. The bowls were arranged symmetrically, and the deck below the workbench showed wear marks in the composite coating where people had knelt repeatedly over weeks or months. I counted the hanging components. 14 filtration membranes, 9 valve assemblies, more than 30 meters of distribution tubing. The scale of the removal was beyond what one person could manage. This was sustained, organized extraction carried out by multiple people with system access and chaplaincy credentials. I left the bay, sealed the door, and told Gil I would need Deacon Fisk's schedule for the past 6 months. Gil nodded, his face empty, and said he would arrange a meeting. He disappeared into the chaplaincy's back corridors before I reached the ladder. I did not have grounds to detain him yet. The religious practice charter had been built to keep security from improvising authority inside chaplaincy space, and a shrine made of stolen membranes was still a jurisdictional argument until command accepted the sabotage case. So I tagged Gil's transponder for passive monitoring, notified the D-Deck watch to log his contacts, and let him go. He was going to warn Fisk. That was useful. A warned man sometimes prepares too well, and the preparation reveals the shape of what he is hiding. Commander Stuart Mackey, my superior and the head of the ship's internal security division, kept his office on the command deck. I gave him the summary in flat terms. A dead chaplain sealed inside a primary recycler, missing filtration components displayed as religious artifacts, falsified inspection reports, and a pattern of unauthorized system access extending across the hydroponics division. The sabotage was organized, ongoing, and directly affecting water quality to the residential decks. Mackey listened, calculating political cost. The chaplaincy operated under a religious practice charter that granted it significant autonomy within the hydroponics division, a legacy arrangement from the first generation that no subsequent command council had seen fit to revoke. Restricting religious practice on a ship with 300 years of voyage remaining was a decision that could fracture the crew's social order far worse than bad water. "Continue the murder investigation," Mackey said. "Document the system interference. I'll take the sabotage issue to the command council, but I need you to separate criminal activity from protected religious practice. Give me something I can act on without turning this into a persecution narrative. People are drinking contaminated water right now, Commander, and the council will address that through the proper channels. What I need from you is the murder. Solve the murder, and the rest becomes actionable." I left his office knowing exactly what he was telling me. Solve it quietly, and solve it fast, before the sabotage became a political problem that outgrew a criminal one. Morning ration hour on Deck 7. I went to observe before my scheduled meeting with Fisk, because I wanted to see the contamination at the point of delivery, where the ship's water systems terminated in the dispensers that crew families lined up to use twice a day. The ration queue stretched along the corridor outside the Deck 7 commissary, 40 or 50 people waiting in the blue-white overhead light for their daily water allotment. Families with children, single crew members, pairs of technicians still in work coveralls from the early shift. The dispensers were recessed into the wall at chest height, 6 units in a row, each fitted with a metering valve that tracked individual ration cards. The water coming out was brown. A visible tint caught the light as it poured into cups and bottles, cloudy ochre, translucent enough to see through but present enough to notice. The crew members who were not expecting it held their cups at arm's length and stared. A man in fabrication coveralls tilted his cup and watched the water move. 2 boys, 10 or 11 years old, stood with their father and looked up at him as the discoloured water filled their cups. The father was Kip Alderman. I recognised him, a water technician from the distribution maintenance team, someone I had interviewed 2 years earlier during a ration fraud case on this deck. He saw me and separated from the line. 3 maintenance requests, Alderman said, keeping his voice low enough that the queue did not hear. 3. All cancelled by chaplaincy authorization. My boys have had stomach cramps for a week. The official report says fabrication delays on replacement filters. You want to tell me why security hasn't stepped in? I'm stepping in now. My kids are drinking that. He lifted his cup so I could see the water clearly. The sediment swirled when he moved it. Everyone's kids are drinking that. I told Alderman I would follow up with him directly. He went back to his boys, and I stayed at the edge of the corridor to watch the rest of the distribution. Roughly a quarter of the people in line accepted the brown water without hesitation. They carried small silver cups, uniform in size, different from the standard issue containers. Children in this group held their cups beneath the dispensers and waited while the discoloured water filled them. As each child drank, an adult moved along the line and dipped a thumb into the water, then pressed the wet pad against the child's forehead, leaving a dark smear that glistened under the corridor lights. The children held still for the marking. Some closed their eyes. The adults who performed it murmured words I could not make out from my position, though the rhythm suggested liturgy. The non-sect families watched. The ration line was public space, and whatever the chaplaincy's people were doing fell within the broad protections of the religious practice charter. But the expressions on the watching faces ranged from discomfort to anger, held in check by the presence of children. These were not fringe believers performing private devotions in a converted maintenance bay. This was a public congregation, organised enough to distribute its own liturgical cups and conduct rituals in a shared corridor, confident enough to mark children's foreheads with contaminated water in full view of crew members who were frightened of what came out of their taps. Before the meeting, I had Judd send me Recycler 4's operational log for the night Greaves died. Reverse flow activation at 22:17, authorised from the Deck 7 Blessing Chamber Terminal under Greaves's credential. I met Deacon Paul Fisk an hour later in the chaplaincy blessing chamber, a clean room on the upper hydroponics level with a shallow stone basin set into the floor and a tap that fed it from a dedicated line. Fisk was already seated when I arrived. He was in his 50s, lean. His vestments were the same blue-grey as Gil's and the dead man's, but his carried a narrow silver hem at the cuffs that marked his deaconate rank. He expressed grief for Greaves. He described the chaplain as a gifted spiritual leader who had done more to deepen the crew's relationship with the ship's water systems than any of his predecessors. His words were careful and offered without being prompted. Deacon. The maintenance bay on sub-level 2 has been converted into a shrine built from active filtration components pulled from functioning water systems. Fisk inclined his head. The components were released from service under chaplaincy authority. Our charter grants us oversight of the water blessing process and, by precedent, input on filtration standards that affect the spiritual integrity of the supply. Spiritual integrity. The ship was designed to sustain bodies, investigator. That was the engineering mandate. But the chaplaincy exists because someone in the first generation understood that bodies arrive empty if the spirit is not sustained with them. Synthetic filtration produces chemically adequate, spiritually inert water. It keeps the blood moving. It does not keep the soul viable for what waits at the end of the voyage. And the water coming out brown on deck 7? That's spiritually adequate? Transition is painful. The crew has spent 2 centuries dependent on synthetic purification. Weaning them from that dependence requires discomfort. Children are getting sick. Children are the least practiced at resisting grace. He folded his hands in his lap. Their bodies tell the truth sooner. I watched Fisk as he spoke. His composure had weight, still hands, measured sentences, patient attention to my objections, as though he had expected and accounted for them long ago. He was an administrator with a theology and a charter and 15 years of institutional positioning, and he believed what he was saying with the same thoroughness that a ship's engineer believed in pressure tolerances. Chaplain Greaves sealed himself inside an active primary recycler and drowned. You're calling that a devotional act? A deep blessing, Fisk said, an immersive communion with the water the chaplain served. It is rare and it is dangerous, and Malcolm understood the risk. I believe he misjudged the current. The access logs show only his credentials. As they would, a deep blessing is private. The chaplain enters alone. And the fact that the recycler was running a reverse flow cycle at the time of his death? Fisk's expression held steady, but his fingers shifted their weight on his knee. A small redistribution, as though the hand had flinched and corrected itself. The baptism cycle is a sanctioned function of the system, he said. It may have been scheduled. Scheduled by whom? Any ranking member of the clergy. Myself. Brother Gil. Chaplain Greaves himself. The authorization log shows the cycle was triggered from the blessing chamber terminal, the one you're sitting 6 feet from right now. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Fisk filled it with a slow, measured exhalation. The blessing chamber terminal is used for many functions. I would need to review the specific log entry before I could speak to its context. I left the meeting without arresting him, without accusing him, and without giving him anything he could use to build a defense before I had the full reconstruction. He had given me enough. The hand that moved on his knee when I mentioned the reverse flow cycle, the rehearsed explanation for the drowning, the doctrinal framework that reframed sabotage as spiritual practice and murder as liturgical accident, the 3-second silence before his pivot on the terminal log, the pause of a man who had an answer prepared but needed to verify how much I knew. I went back to the recycler bay at third watch with Alec Burridge, a hydroponics systems technician with no chaplaincy affiliation and a reputation among maintenance crews for knowing the water infrastructure better than anyone else aboard. Burridge was quiet, competent, and visibly uncomfortable about being asked to help a security investigation inside his own division. I needed someone who could explain the recycler's operating sequences in terms I could work with, and Burridge was the name that kept surfacing whenever I asked who actually understood how these machines functioned. "Walk me through the baptism cycle," I told him as we stood on the catwalk above the drained and resealed Recycler 4. "Everything it does, everything it touches, and every way it can be triggered." Burridge leaned on the railing and looked down at the empty cylinder below. "Start with the machine, or start with what the chaplaincy did to it." "The machine." Burridge took me down from the catwalk to a secondary recycler unit, offline for maintenance, drained and depressurized, and opened the access hatch so I could see the interior layout up close. The cylinder's inner wall was lined with injection ports at 3 heights, low, mid, and upper. In normal operation, water entered through the low ports, rose through the filtration medium, passed through the membrane bank, and exited through the upper ports into the distribution headers. A simple upward current, gravity assisted by the ship's rotational architecture. The floor grating covered an emergency drain that fed back into the collection reservoir beneath the unit. "Standard circulation moves water up and out," Burridge said, tracing the flow path with his hand. "The system has 4 modes. Standard, deep clean purge, which runs a chemical flush at high pressure. Emergency drain, which dumps the column through the floor grating in about 90 seconds. And the fourth one. The baptism cycle. Burridge nodded. He pulled up the system schematic on the maintenance panel beside the open hatch. Added 60 years ago during a refit. The chaplaincy requested it. It reverses the flow. Water comes in through the upper ports and cycles downward through the column, then exits through the low ports back into the reservoir. The theology is return, humility, purification through descent. In normal use, the chamber is empty during the cycle. Nobody's supposed to be inside. But if someone were, the reverse flow fills the column from the top. The drain can clear ordinary service water, but reverse flow pushes volume down faster than the drain can evacuate it. The chamber floods. You'd have maybe 2 minutes before the water reached the upper ports and the column was full. How do you stop it from inside? The bypass reset wheel. Burridge pointed to an access panel on the interior wall, about chest height. Behind the panel sat a heavy steel wheel, 20 centimeters across, with a knurled grip surface. Its calibration marks were stamped directly into the housing. Bypass open, partial restore, filter seal. The chaplaincy didn't just pull membranes, Burridge said. They opened filtration bypasses. That let water route around missing membrane banks without tripping a full distribution shutdown. The ship thinks it's compensating for a maintenance condition. In practice, it sends partially treated water onward. And the wheel closes that bypass. Only from inside the sealed chamber. Bad design from an old refit, but it was meant to prevent pressure shock. The valve seat has to lock under load, with the chamber isolated and pressurized. Maintenance normally sends 2 techs in with a lockout and an external monitor. One person can do it, but it's hard. He touched the metal rim of the wheel. Open to partial is stiff. Partial to filter seal is worse. At the final position, the bypass closes, and the system trips a safety interlock that cancels reverse flow. Under full water pressure with the chamber flooding, you'd need serious grip strength and about 45 seconds of sustained cranking to move it through all 3 stages. 45 seconds of cranking a resistant steel wheel while the water rose past your waist, your chest, your throat. With wet hands. In the dark, the interior lighting would short once the upper ports submerged. Who can trigger the baptism cycle? Any terminal with chaplaincy level access. The authorization chain is limited to 3 active credentials: the chaplain, the deacon, and the assistant. Greaves, Fisk, and Gil. I had Burridge pull the system log for Recycler 4 on the night of the killing. The entries were time-stamped and tagged with both credential and terminal location. Greaves's physical access credential opened the recycler hatch at 21:42 and sealed it behind him. For the next 35 minutes, the log showed isolated service status, the recycler idle, the hatch sealed, the chamber pressurized for internal bypass reset. Then, at 22:17, the baptism cycle activated. The authorizing credential was Greaves's own. The terminal location tag read, Blessing Chamber, Deck 7, Hydroponics Block. Greaves was inside the recycler on the lower maintenance level. The Blessing Chamber was 3 decks above, in the chaplaincy's workspace. He could not have triggered the cycle from inside the column. Someone used his credentials from the wrong location, I said. Burridge studied the log entry, his mouth a thin line. Credential sharing is against maintenance protocol. But within the chaplaincy, the clergy have been running their own access rules for decades. If Greaves shared his authorization codes with Fisk or Gil, or if someone copied them, then the system would log it as Greaves's command regardless of who typed it. I had Burridge cross-reference the ship's general activity logs for the same time window. Fisk's personal location transponder placed him in the Deck 7 Blessing Chamber from 2000 hours through 0400, a full 8-hour overnight vigil. His movement log showed him in that room the entire time. The vigil was a regular event, conducted every 10 days, attended by 30 to 40 congregation members, whose own transponders confirmed their presence. The vigil schedule included 2 ritual water blessings, one at 2030, one at 2217. The blessings were performed remotely from the Blessing Chamber terminal. Fisk, standing before his congregation, would enter the authorization command, and the system would cycle a reverse flow through whichever recycler unit the blessing was directed to. The congregation would pray while the water moved backward through the ship's veins, symbolically descending, symbolically purified. At 22:17, Fisk performed the second blessing. His congregation watched him. 30 to 40 witnesses saw the deacon's hands on the terminal, saw his lips moving through the liturgy, saw the confirmation display light up as the system acknowledged the command. The command flooded Recycler 4 with Malcolm Greaves sealed inside it. The keystroke that blessed the water for his flock also filled a man's lungs with it. Fisk's alibi had become the weapon. I sat with that for a long time on the catwalk, listening to the ambient drone of the circulation pumps in the adjacent units, the sound of a ship keeping itself alive through systems that someone had turned into instruments of murder. Burridge waited beside me. He understood what the log entries meant. I could see it in the way he gripped the catwalk railing, his knuckles pale against the metal. "I need to go back inside Recycler 4, I said. "The actual unit. I need to see the reset wheel." Burridge unsealed the hatch. The interior was dry now, returned to standby after the drain cycle and body removal. The injection ports stared from the walls like empty sockets. I found the access panel at chest height and opened it. The bypass reset wheel sat in its housing, heavy and dark, the knurled surface dull with age. I crouched and looked at it closely under the work lamp Burridge held above my shoulder. The wheel was frozen at partial restore, second of 3 stages. Someone had turned it from bypass open through partial but had failed to reach filter seal. In the grooves of the knurled grip, pressed deep into the patterned metal by the force of desperate fingers, I found what I had been looking for since I first saw Malcolm Greaves's ruined hands. Fingernail fragments, 3 of them, pale crescents jammed into the steel knurling, torn from the nail bed by the torque of a man cranking a resistant wheel, while water rose around him and his grip failed. I called Dr. Corwin down to extract and match them. The confirmation came within the hour. Keratin samples consistent with the tissue from Greaves's right hand, the hand with the worst damage, the hand that had done the hardest work against the wheel. Burridge checked the valve position twice, running the measurements against the calibration markers on the housing. 2/3 closed, he said, and his voice carried something I rarely heard from technicians. Anger beneath the precision. He almost made it. If he'd gotten the wheel to seal, Recycler 4 would have dropped out of reverse flow and restored full membrane routing. Biggest single unit in the residential water chain. Greaves went to the recycler that night to close the filtration bypass that the sect had forced open. He entered alone at third watch, using his own credentials to avoid raising an alert. He sealed the hatch because the reset procedure required an isolated, pressurized chamber. He went to the bypass reset wheel and tried to close it by hand. While he was inside, fighting to undo what his people had done to the ship's water, Paul Fisk triggered the baptism cycle and drowned him in the very system Greaves was trying to save. The chaplain had turned against his own sect. The founder had become the apostate. The deacon had executed him for it, using a public ceremony as cover and the ship's own religious infrastructure as a murder weapon. I brought Brother Gil into security holding on D-deck. He came without physical resistance. I sat him in the interview room, a plain compartment with a table, 2 chairs and a recording unit, and placed the evidence in front of him, piece by piece. The log entries showing the credential location mismatch, the valve position measurements, the copied access string Fisk had used from the blessing chamber terminal. Gil denied knowledge of each in the same careful voice he had used outside Greaves's office. Then I placed the sealed sample tray on the table. 3 fingernail fragments extracted from the reset wheel of the machine that killed his chaplain. Gil stared at the tray. His face worked through something complicated. Grief, fear, calculation, something that might have been shame, and settled into a hollow blankness that told me the wall was close, but still standing. He knew, I said. Greaves knew what the brown water was doing. He wrote it down. He tried to close the bypass before the children got sicker. Gil's eyes stayed on the tray. He got the wheel 2/3 shut while Fisk was flooding the chamber. That is what those are. Proof that he was working the wheel. He spent the last minute of his life trying to undo what you helped protect. Gil pressed his hands flat on the table. His fingertips whitened against the surface. He argued with Fisk for weeks, he said. I waited. Greaves said we were poisoning the ship. He called it murder by pipeline. He said the children were going to get sicker and then they were going to die. And when they died, the blood would be on the chaplaincy's hands. What did Fisk say? That suffering was consecration. That the children who sickened were being purified faster than the adults because their spirits were less contaminated by dependence on the old systems. That any who died would arrive at the destination before the rest of us, carried there by the water itself. And you believed that? Gil's fingers pressed harder. I believed it when Fisk said it. Then Greaves said what he said. Then I saw the brown water in the children's cups and the marks on their foreheads. You monitored Greaves for Fisk. You reported when he accessed the recycler bay at night. The silence in the room had weight. Gil breathed through it. Fisk asked me to track Greaves's off-schedule movements. He said it was for the chaplain's protection, that Greaves was unstable, that he might do something dangerous. I told Fisk when Greaves went to the recycler bay. I told him the night it happened. I sent a message from my quarters at 21:30, 12 minutes before Greaves entered the hatch. Did you know what Fisk would do? I thought he wanted to confront Greaves, to catch him in the act of resealing the bypass and bring him before the congregation for judgment. I thought it would be an argument. A tribunal. His voice thinned. The blankness cracked, and beneath it was the face of a young man who had provided the timing for a murder and spent every hour since calculating whether his ignorance was real or performed. I gave him the time, Gil said. Fisk used it. I charged Gil as an accessory and held him in the D-deck cell block. He did not ask for a chaplaincy advocate. He did not invoke the religious practice charter. He sat on the bunk in his blue-grey vestments and stared at the wall. And when the cell door sealed behind me, I heard him begin to pray in a whisper that I chose to leave behind. I took the full reconstruction to Commander Mackey. The credential theft, the baptism cycle, the valve position, the fingernails, Gil's testimony. Mackey listened, asked 2 clarifying questions, and authorized the arrest of Deacon Paul Fisk. When I contacted the hydroponics block to request a security escort to the chaplaincy offices, the duty officer told me that Fisk was already beyond reach of a quiet arrest. He had called an emergency congregation in the main grow bay, the largest single compartment in the hydroponics division, 200 meters long and 80 wide, its crop trays producing 1/3 of the ship's food supply. 80 or more sect members were assembling there, and the duty officer had seen chaplaincy personnel carrying tools toward the bay's water distribution headers. Burridge, still in the systems office where I had left him running valve diagnostics, called me on a separate channel. His voice was tight with urgency, his usual composure stripped down to alarm. They've overridden access locks on filtration banks 9 and 12, he said. Both are grow bay feeders, and Haddon, they're not just pulling cartridges, they're opening the raw loop header. What happens if they get it open? The whole agricultural loop takes unfiltered reservoir feed at once. The roots will absorb it before we can flush. We lose this crop cycle, maybe the next one. I took 6 officers from D-deck security and went to the grow bay. The compartment was vast and warm, rows of engineered crops stretching under full-spectrum panels that simulated a daylight the ship had never carried. The crop trays sat in tiered racks, green and dense, fed by irrigation lines that branched from the main water distribution headers, running along the ceiling like exposed arteries. At the far end of the bay, near the primary distribution junction where the headers converged, Fisk stood on a maintenance platform 3 meters above the deck. Below him and around him, his congregation moved through the crop rows with purpose and coordination. They were pulling filter cartridges from the grow bay's internal recycling units, cylindrical housings mounted at intervals along the irrigation runs, and passing them down the rows hand to hand, a human chain feeding the extracted components toward the back of the bay, where they were being stacked in growing piles. Above them, two men in chaplaincy vestments worked at the raw loop header with torque bars. One retaining clamp was already open. A second hung half-loosened beneath the pipe. The header shuddered against its restraints every few seconds, pressure knocking through the metal. Fisk saw us enter and kept speaking. His voice carried across the bay, amplified by the hard surfaces and the high ceiling, and his congregation kept working while he spoke. The words were liturgical, a blessing cycle, a consecration of the water that would flow through the crops unfiltered and uncontaminated by synthetic membranes. The silver hem on his cuffs caught the grow light as he raised his hands over the junction above him. "Deacon Fisk." My voice was smaller than his in that space, but I did not try to match his volume. I walked up the center aisle between crop racks, my officers in a loose formation behind me. "You are under arrest for the murder of Chaplain Malcolm Greaves. Step down from the platform." Fisk looked at me. "Investigator Haddon, you are interrupting a consecration service protected under the ship's religious practice charter. The men on that header have 10 seconds to put down their tools." His eyes stayed on me, and the men kept working. "Malcolm Greaves went into Recycler 4 to reseal the filtration bypass your people forced open," I said. "You activated the baptism cycle from the blessing chamber using his stolen credentials and drowned him while your congregation watched you do it. The arrest is for murder. The charter does not cover murder." Something shifted in the bay. The hand-to-hand chain slowed. Faces turned toward the platform, toward me, back to Fisk. The congregation had heard me, and for most of them, this was new information. They had been told their chaplain died in a devotional act, and the word murder worked through the rows like vibration through pipe. The men at the header kept going. One of them reset his torque bar and leaned his weight against it. "Dent," I said. Corporal Lewis Dent broke from formation and ran for the ladder bolted to the junction frame. Two of my officers followed. Fisk adjusted. I watched him do it, the slight recalibration of posture, the deepened breath, the way his hands came down from their raised position and settled against the railing of the platform. He was deciding how to hold his people. "Brother Greaves lost his faith," Fisk said, projecting past me, speaking to the congregation. "He attempted to reseal the systems we had liberated. He entered the recycler in defiance of the covenant. The water took him because he turned his back on what we are building here, and the water does not forgive apostasy. You typed a command on a terminal and reversed the flow while he was trapped inside. You knew he was in there because Brother Gil told you 12 minutes before Greaves opened the hatch." Dent reached the junction ladder. One of Fisk's men kicked down at his hand. Dent took the blow across the knuckles but kept climbing. I was close to the platform now. Two of my officers had moved to flank the base. The congregation pressed closer, a wall of blue-grey vestments and work clothes and frightened faces. Some of them were crying, some were praying. A few, younger men, Fisk's inner circle, positioned themselves between my officers and the platform with the stiff-legged readiness of people who had never been in a real confrontation but had decided to stand in one. Fisk stared down at me. The calm was still there, but under it something had changed. The administrator's composure had thinned, and beneath it I could see the conviction. Raw, total, unbargainable. He believed the water was alive with purpose. He believed the ship's filtration systems were a spiritual disease. He believed that 300 years from now, when the Colburn reached its destination, the people who walked off this ship would be whole only if they had suffered the purification he was forcing on them. He believed Greaves's drowning was just. "Every membrane we remove brings this crew closer to what they were meant to be," Fisk said. "You can put me in a cell, You can seal this bay. The water will remember what we started. Step down, Deacon. Above us, Dent reached the raw loop header and drove his shoulder into the man with the torque bar. The tool clanged loose, bounced once off the frame, and fell into a crop tray below. The second man lunged for the half-loosened clamp. One of my officers caught him around the waist and pulled him backward before his hands reached the latch. For the first time, Fisk looked away from me. That was when we took him. The young men at the base of the platform tensed when my officers moved in, and one of them threw a shoulder into Dent's partner hard enough to knock him into a crop rack. The rack toppled, spilling soil and seedlings across the deck. 2 more sect members surged forward. The scuffle was ugly and brief. My officers were trained, and the believers were frightened and clumsy. When Fisk's wrists were bound behind his back, most of the resistance dissolved into weeping, raised voices, and a desperate scramble to pull more filter cartridges from the irrigation lines before we could stop them. I ordered the grow bay sealed and all chaplaincy credentials revoked across the ship's entire system network. Burridge and the hydroponics maintenance crews worked through the rest of the night, resealing bypassed valves and reinstalling salvageable filtration components. The damage assessment came in by morning. 6 filtration banks partially or fully stripped, 2 water distribution headers contaminated beyond quick repair. The raw loop header had stayed shut by 1 retaining clamp in less than a minute. The fabrication division estimated 4 months to produce replacement membranes and valve assemblies at priority pace. 3 residential decks would be on boil advisory water restrictions for a minimum of 6 weeks. The grow bay's internal recycling loop had lost enough capacity that a portion of the crop cycle would need to be suspended, reducing food production for the quarter. Fisk went into a security cell on D-deck, 2 doors from Gil. The Command Council convened an emergency session that afternoon and retroactively authorized my actions in the grow bay: the forced entry, the physical confrontation, the system-wide credential revocation. In the same session, they formally censured the Deck Security Bureau for failing to identify and escalate the sabotage campaign before it reached critical infrastructure. The censure fell on Mackey's division, and Mackey directed it downward onto the investigation that had spent its first 2 days following the evidence, while the council waited for alarms that never came through the walls it had built around the chaplaincy's autonomy. I took the censure because the alternative was a public accusation that the Command Council had ignored the threat, and a ship with 3 centuries of voyage ahead of it could not afford to watch its governance structure tear itself apart over blame. Alderman found me in the corridor outside the council chamber. He had his 2 boys with him. They carried standard-issue water cups, the clear ones, and the water in them was clean. The boil advisory had already improved supply on the upper residential decks where the filtration banks were intact. "My boys are drinking clear water again," Alderman said. "I wanted you to see that." I looked at the boys. They were young, skinny, with their father's colouring and the watchful posture of children who had absorbed weeks of adult fear without fully understanding its source. One of them still had a faded brown mark on his forehead, the residue of a wet thumb pressed there during ration hour, days ago, carrying a theology he was too young to refuse. "Good," I said. It was the only word I had. That night, 3rd watch again, I went back to Primary Recycler 4. The bay was quiet. Judd's maintenance crews had finished the emergency restoration that afternoon, and the recycler stood sealed and pressurized in its plinth, cycling forward, doing its work. Through the transparent wall, clean water moved in its upward current, rising through the column, passing through membranes and treatment stages, exiting through the upper ports, flowing into the distribution headers that carried it to the taps, where 4,000 people would drink tomorrow without knowing what had happened inside this cylinder. The bypass reset wheel behind its access panel was fully sealed. A maintenance tech had finished what Greaves started. The final third of a turn, the simple completion of a dead man's last act. The water ran through membranes and chemical balancing as the ship's designers had intended. and it came out clean. I stood on the catwalk and looked down at the cylinder. Fisk was in a cell. Gil was cooperating. The murder was solved, the method documented, the motive recorded. The Command Council would hold a tribunal, and the tribunal would find what I had found, and Fisk would spend the rest of his life in the restricted housing block where the Colburn kept the people it could not release back into the population. But 80 people had stood in the grow bay and listened to Fisk tell them the water does not forgive apostasy, and some of them had wept because they believed it. The congregation would fracture. Some would recant. Some would go quiet. Some would fold back into the ship's routines and carry the doctrine in silence, the way a healed bone still carries the line of its break. 300 years of Voyage remained. The sect's theology had spread to families with children on decks that had never seen the inside of a hydroponics bay. And the question Fisk had planted, whether the systems keeping them alive were also keeping them from becoming what the destination required, would outlast his imprisonment because it lived in a place that filtration membranes and override wheels could not reach. Greaves had known that. He had helped build the doctrine before he understood what it would cost, and when the cost arrived in the form of brown water in children's cups, he went down to the recycler alone at third watch to close a valve with his bare hands. He got it 2/3 shut. It almost saved them. The water cycled below me, clean and forward-flowing, carrying nothing visible. I left the bay. Behind me, the pumps ran on, doing the only thing they knew how to do for a ship that would need them for longer than anyone aboard could imagine,